Hello, everyone, and welcome to the BioBus Student Town Hall Live. My name is Marina, and I'm a scientist who works at BioBus. I first want to go over the mystery microscope image. So this picture is actually a close-up of an amphipod, which is like a shrimp cousin. And it was found at the low tide in the mud of the Harlem River. So you know that at BioBus, we love to use microscopes. So you have that nice microscope image of our amphipod. So BioBus is a nonprofit organization that works to bring science to everyone. And we have a different couple ways that we do that. So one way is mobile laboratories that come to your school. You can see the BioBus here in these pictures. We also have a community laboratory space called the BioBase, where we host classes and big public events for everyone. It's in Harlem on 125th and Broadway, next to the 1 train, and we hope that you'll join us there to do some science when the space opens up again. Since we are all at home right now, BioBus is finding new ways to bring people opportunities to do science. So we have live interactive online lab classes called Discover at Home, which are hosted by BioBus scientists. We also have a weekly science challenge called Explore at Home, where you'll find different experiment challenges that you can do at home and submit your data. Those videos launch every Monday. Plus, we hold these student town halls every Thursday, and our next town hall will actually be all about birds. For the summer, we're going to change our time to 1 p.m. on Thursdays. So ask all of your bird questions now at biobus.org/townhall. Tell your friends and tune in next Thursday at 1 p.m. to learn something new about birds. And you can learn more about all of these things at biobus.org. Check out the link in the description below. So the topic today is New York City waterways. Here in New York, we live with a lot of different bodies of waters, rivers, marshes, ponds, wetlands, and even an ocean. So our two guest scientists study these waterways, what lives in them, and how we can measure their health and work to protect them. We have two scientists here with us today, Cheng from the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay and the New York Sea Grant, and Rob Buchanan from the Billion Oyster Project, who will answer all of your questions, and you can start adding them into the chat right now. So Helen and Rob, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, I just unmuted myself. Hey everybody, my name is Rob. I work for the Billion Oyster Project. You can see it on my shirt. And we are based on Governor's Island, which is an island off the tip of Manhattan. And we have a couple of missions. One of them is to grow oysters. Here's an oyster shell. To grow 1 billion oysters and put them into the harbor by the year 2035. So that's a 20-year project, and we have a lot of places we're putting oysters in the water. The other thing that we do is education, and I'm part of the education team. And we hand out smaller cages like this with oysters in them for students and community scientists to steward or to take care of. We also have started a water testing program, which I'm responsible for. And I'm actually talking to you from our water testing lab in Brooklyn right now. And another thing that we do is just try to put people in touch with the harbor and make them comfortable around the water and feel a connection to the water. So another program of ours, which I'm very interested in, is boat building. And we have built boats with middle school students in Sunset Park and with high school students on Governor's Island at the Harbor School. So those are some of the things that I do, and really looking forward to your questions and talking about this harbor, which I think is one of the most beautiful harbors in the whole world. And we just need to green it up a bit and get a little bit more life happening. And it will be an even more beautiful place in the future.
Thanks, Rob. Go ahead, Helen.
Hi, everybody. My name is Helen. I am a scientist working at the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay, which is based out of Brooklyn College, and New York Sea Grant, which is based out of Cornell University. So I work a lot with university folks, students, and researchers. Like Rob, I agree. New York City has one of the best waterways and harbors in the world. It's very important to us both on the animal side as well as the community side. So my role is to help connect coastal science to communities, as well as raise awareness about different issues relating to the wildlife, but also to climate change and how things are happening in New York City relating to our water, to our communities. Our role is to elevate community voices, bring research to communities as well as community needs to back to our researchers, and really highlight the good work that's happening across all our coastal communities. We also teach students about how to appreciate the water in our coasts, as well as teach people about how to prepare for climate change and how to be resilient to it. And we'll talk more about that later this session. So I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you, Helen. And we also have a special guest, a BioBus junior scientist here who's in the chat collecting your questions. So ask anything that you want to know in the chat. Brianna, if you'd like to introduce yourself and tell us something that you love about New York's waterways.
Hi, my name's Brianna. Some things I like about New York waterways are that it's full of life. It is so important that we recognize this because we need to keep it safe so that New York waterways life can become a lot diverse.
Beautiful. Thank you, Brianna. So how this is going to work, you all submitted some amazing questions ahead of time, and I'll be asking them to our guest scientists. But remember, we'll also be taking questions from the chat. So if you're curious about something, put it in that chat and we can ask your question to the scientists. Tell us your name, age, and school. So scientist rules, you have about 2 minutes to answer each question. If you start running out of time, my co-host, Alfie the elephant, will appear, and that means that you have to wrap it up so that we can go on to answer more questions from our young scientists. So let's get going. This question is for Helen. Is there more than one waterway? That question was asked by Uriel, who is 9 years old.
That is a really great question. And let me try to show you if we have more than one waterway. So this is a little bit of the map of the United States. It's the Northeast, and we are right here. Actually, we're this little dot right here. And if you zoom in, let me see if I do this correctly. This is a map of New York City. And New York City is mostly surrounded by water. So we definitely have more than one waterway. We have the harbor here. We have the Hudson River and the East River, and it's supposed to be this way, and the Atlantic Ocean situated around here. So we definitely have multiple bodies of water. In fact, New York City is surrounded by 520 miles of coastline. So it is definitely more of an island if you think about it, in addition to being a city megatropolis with over 8.5 million people. So just put that in perspective, just how many people are living in our city surrounded by water.
Well, super cool to think about how we all live kind of together. We have a question from Amani, who's 10 years old. The question is, why is the East River called the East River? And what makes a river a river? I think both of our scientists wanna speak on this. So why doesn't Rob go ahead, and then we can go to Helen.
The East River was named because it's on the east side of Manhattan. And at the point when Manhattan was first settled by Europeans, the river at that point led east towards Long Island. And so they called it the East River. But what's interesting about the East, what's most interesting about the East River is that it's not really a river in the traditional sense. A river is something that carries water from higher altitudes down to the sea. The East River is at sea level, and it really is a part of the sea. It's an arm of the sea. It's called a strait, and it connects two larger parts of the sea, the harbor and the Atlantic Ocean on one end and Long Island Sound on the other. It seems like it flows like rivers do, but that's just the tide moving in one direction. If you come back and look at the East River 6 hours later, it will be moving in the other direction because the tide has turned and is running the other direction. So it's a misnomer, and a misnomer meaning it's in some ways misnamed. It's not a river, it's a strait, and that's something you can really fool your friends and maybe even your parents with by saying, is the East River really a river? And if they say yes, then you have to say, no, it's not.
Awesome, Rob. That's funny. So now we all can be semi-tricksters. Helen, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think Rob is, Rob is absolutely correct. I'll also add that most of the time we think of rivers as fresh water, so water that kind of comes out of our sink or we can drink from. But actually, it is both fresh and salt water. So water that's similar to the ocean. If you've ever had ocean water in your mouth accidentally, it tastes really salty. So the East River is the same, where it's both fresh and salt water. So Rob is right. It's not really a river, but it sort of looks that way. So yeah.
Cool. And this question from Gavin, who's 11, is also for Rob, and it's kind of related to the previous question. But Gavin wants to know, why are there rivers in the first place?
Why are there rivers? When water falls on the land, that water has to go somewhere. And if there are things blocking it, it might pool up and it might form a lake. And that's how, that's basically how lakes are formed. But eventually so much water builds up that it has to break out of whatever is confining it. And it starts to flow downhill. Water always runs downhill. And so really what rivers are, and if you look at the map of the country or the continent, they're just a series of veins or arteries that bring water down from high places down to lower places. And eventually the lowest place of all is the sea. So all rivers run to the sea. And it's that cycle, that water cycle, that really is responsible for all of the life we have on Earth, at least on the terrestrial part of Earth, is that movement of water from the mountains down to the ocean. That's why there are rivers.
Awesome, thank you. So now we can add to our answer when we say, the East River is not a river, and this is why. So I have a question for Helen. Noelle, who is 11, asks, why is there a part of the ocean called the Atlantic Ocean? And Karen, who is 8, asks, how far does the Atlantic Ocean actually go?
Yeah, great question. So in our entire Earth, we actually have 4 to 5, depending on who you ask, 4 oceans. We have our Atlantic, Pacific, Indian, and Arctic, and some people actually call Antarctic an ocean too. The Atlantic Ocean is literally right next to us, pretty much. If you ever go to Rockaway Beach or if you go to Staten Island, the Atlantic Ocean is there. That's it. The Atlantic Ocean is actually the second largest ocean in the world, with the Pacific Ocean being the first. And if you go pretty much from north to south, from all the way up to the Arctic down to the Antarctic, from the east coast of where we are to where London and England, Europe basically is, in Africa, that is all the Atlantic Ocean. And it's really, really big, considering it'd be the second largest ocean in the world. And actually, fun fact, the name Atlantic Ocean comes from a Greek god called Atlas. So little fun language, Greek. You want to learn a little Greek there associated with that.
Cool. So we're learning a lot of fun facts to tell our parents and our friends or our families. All right, so let's take some questions from the chat. If you're chatting in the live questions, remember to add your name, age, and school. So I'll see if Brianna has any questions for us.
A question that we have is, why is the water around New York City more polluted than in most other places? Is it just because of high population density from life? Wait, how do you pronounce that?
Ife.
Oh, Ife, sorry. 12 years old and homeschooled.
And that question is for Helen.
Oh, very good question. And I'm also going to look to Rob to help me answer this question too. You know, because a lot of people live near the coast, oftentimes people can be irresponsible and not throw things in the right trash. It is partly due to the population of people. Again, we have 8.5 million people, and that's why it's super important to educate folks to be able to put trash in the right receptacle, to throw trash properly instead of letting it fly. Oftentimes when people are on beaches, they bring a lot of stuff with them, but they don't necessarily throw it out properly. So there's a lot of work being done to do beach cleanups, to help and also educate folks. And things like recycling is super important, reducing the amount of plastics that we use, right? So it's partly due to that as well.
Cool. Rob, do you want to add a little bit to something to that? That question was, why is the water around New York City more polluted than in most other places? I know that you mentioned doing some water quality testing, so.
Right. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about a little bit about our water testing program, which does look at that pollution, and it looks at one kind of pollution, which is sewage pollution. So it's pollution that is caused by people, and the reason that we have that problem is, yes, this is the biggest city in the country. We're right on the water, but it's also because we're a really old city, and the sewers were originally not designed to do anything except move sewage into the harbor. We made big progress starting in about 1970 by building treatment plants for all of our sewage, and that made a huge difference. But when it rains, we still have this problem where rainwater and sewage combine in the pipe in your street, and the plants can't handle how much combined sewage there is, and so some of it bypasses into the harbor. And that's something that we look at closely and we test. And we find that on rainy days when we test, the numbers are much worse than they are on sunny days like today. And in fact, on sunny days, the good news is that most places in the harbor meet the standards for swimming when it's sunny. But when it rains, many places in the harbor still do not meet those standards. So that's going to be a long-term project to try and make the harbor completely swimmable. And I don't know if it'll happen in my lifetime, but maybe in your lifetimes it could.
Thanks for working so hard on that, Rob and Helen. I think we have another question actually that's really perfect for Rob. Maybe Brianna can let us know what that question is.
The next question is from Lucas. He says, how resistant to pollution are the oysters and what species are they?
Okay, that does sound like an oyster question. And on the East Coast, all the way from Florida to Maine, there's only one species of oyster. It's called the Eastern oyster. This is what they look like when they're fully grown. And the question of how resistant are they to pollution is a really good one. And it's actually surprising how resistant they are. They do really well. We put oysters in places near some of those sewage outfalls that I was talking about, and they actually seem to thrive. So they themselves are not bothered by that. However, because of that proximity to sewage, we can't eat the oysters from this harbor. So it's good and it's bad. We're not growing oysters in order to eat them or to sell them to other people to eat. We're growing them because of the habitat that they provide, and because of the water filtration they do, and because of the way they protect the edge of the city from storms. But it would be great someday if we could eat these oysters, and so maybe that will happen. But for now, we shouldn't worry too much about them. They seem to be pretty happy. They don't think of sewage as sewage. They think of it as extra nutrients. So for the most part, they're okay.
Yum. Okay, so we'll go back to our pre-submitted questions. The first one is also for Rob. So Rob's going on his third question in a row, and it's from Mia, who is 8, and she wants to know, where does the Harlem River start?
Well, that is another question. The Harlem River, like the East River, is not really a river. It is also a strait. It's a body of water that connects 2 other bodies of water. So it has 2 beginnings. You could say it begins at Spuyten Duyvil, which is a place up on the Hudson River, up in Upper Manhattan, Inwood, that neighborhood, kind of close to Yonkers. Or you could say it begins at Hellgate, which is on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, or Astoria, Queens, Randall's Island, that area. So the Harlem River neither begins, it doesn't have a true source like a river. It has 2 heads or 2 tails, depending on how you want to look at it.
Cool, thanks, Rob. Our next question is for Helen, and it's from Joel, who's 8 years old. And he wants to know, how does the river overflow? And how come sometimes none of it overflows?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So a lot of things can make the river overflow, such as a lot of rainfall. But like we said earlier, it's connected to the ocean. So like oceans, there's the rise and the fall of water called high tide and low tide. And so sometimes when it's an extremely high tide event associated with the new and full moons, and actually let me show you what that looks like. So when it's the new, so this is our sun, this is Earth, and this is the moon. When the Earth, moon, and sun are aligned like this, or even opposite, the gravitational force of these 2 celestial bodies raises the water really high. So during the new and full moons, that's when the waters are really high, which can cause the river to overflow onto land, causing sometimes tidal flooding. And so what tidal flooding could look like is this. When you have a low tide and a high tide, but when you have a full and new moon event, you can have higher than normal high tides, which causes overflow of the river or the ocean or the water. So you can have days where it's normal conditions, but you can also have days where it's a bright blue sunny day, it's not raining, but the waters can be really high. And so that's when sometimes the rivers can overflow onto land.
Cool, Helen, thank you. This one's kind of related. So Jonathan wants to know, who's 11, wants to know how big New York City waterways are. Might be a hard question.
I'll take that first, and then maybe Rob can join in. So we have a lot of waterways that we've mentioned before. So the few main waterways that are in our city is the East River, which we've talked about, the Hudson River, which is on the opposite side of Manhattan, closer on the west side. We also have Jamaica Bay, which encompasses southern Brooklyn and Queens and the Rockaways. And then we have our New York Harbor, which covers our New York City part, as well as parts of Jersey or New Jersey. And then we have our Atlantic Ocean, which is on the other side of the Rockaways. So I would say they're pretty large. The Hudson River, for example, is about 315 miles, which extends upstate towards the Poughkeepsie area and the Hudson Valley. So they're pretty long and pretty wide.
Cool. Rob, is there anything you want to add to that one?
I would, let me put it in a different way. I'm part of a community boathouse, and once a year we row around Manhattan, and that takes us about 8.5 or 9 hours to do. So that feels like it's pretty big. And every couple of years we row around Staten Island, and we're not able to do that in a day. We have to camp halfway around. So that might give you a sense of how big the harbor is.
Yeah, sounds like a really exhausting day. We have some questions from the chat. Brianna, do you have something for us? Oh, okay. I'm gonna give us that one actually. So this one's for Rob. It's how much water is surrounding New York City in gallons of water? And maybe you know this one because you work with oysters. It's a hard one.
How many grains of sand are there on the beaches of the world? I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. I think a different kind of scientist would have to take that on. But in fact, the only gallon question I think I can answer is how many gallons of water a day can an oyster filter? An adult oyster can filter about 50 gallons a day. That's not an answer though.
So that the billion oysters, is that expected to be able to maybe filter all of the waterways?
The contents of the harbor? No, I don't think so. Not even a billion oysters. It would take more than that. And we actually just chose that name because it plays off the old project called Million Trees Project. But I think historically there used to be many billions of oysters in the harbor. But we think getting to a billion would be a pretty good start. So that's the goal for now.
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty big goal to move towards. So that's a good name. Brianna has a question for Helen from the chat.
The next question is for Helen. It says, can planting trees along the coast protect waterways?
They have to be the right tree though, right? Like we said, a lot of our water is salty, and for a regular tree that you can see in the park, they can't handle the salt, but there are certain plants and vegetation and even trees that can handle the salt. So if we plant the right things and make space for them too, we can possibly protect our waterways and protect the communities behind those, right? To prevent the flooding and to prevent wave coming over and stuff. So they have to be the right plants in order to be to help us protect our coast.
Cool. So I think Ife has another question about Ife from the chat, who, is 12.97 years old and is homeschooled. And Ife wants to know if the Panama Canal is a strait. I mean, whoever wants that one can take it, if you know.
I love that question. It's not a straight, but it's a really good question. It's tough. What the Panama Canal is a series of locks. So you go in and then you're raised up to another level, and then you go a ways and you're raised up again. And then in the middle of the canal is a lake, an actual natural lake in the middle of Panama. And then you come down the other side in a series of steps. But I think in concept, it is a strait in that it connects, it's not a river, but it connects two larger bodies of water, the Caribbean and the Pacific Ocean. So I think it's a great conceptual comparison. It's strait-like, but it is a canal with a lake in the middle.
Cool. I didn't know that. That's really interesting. That's interesting that there's a lake in the middle of the canal, right? That seems like a pretty unique.
Well, the engineers wanted to take advantage of that because if otherwise they would have had to dig, they would have had to do a lot more digging. So instead they just dug to the lake on one side and dug to the lake on the other side and saved themselves many miles of more digging.
That was really smart engineering. I wonder what effect that had on the life in the canal, in the Panama Canal. And that takes us to our next topic, actually, which is life in the river. So life in our New York waterways. So Rob touched on this a little bit, but specifically Taylor, who's 14, wants to know if it's safe to swim in the Hudson River.
It depends on where in the Hudson River, and it depends on what day, but generally, yes. The answer is yes, it is. There are many things that go into safety. So I think that one of those is lifeguards. Are there beaches with lifeguards? There are only a few places on the Hudson that have that. So in that sense, swimming anywhere on the Hudson probably isn't safe. But in terms of if you were to swallow the water, would it make you sick? In most places, it would not on most days.
That's good to know. So maybe we're starting to change our perspective on the Hudson River and whether it's safe to swim in or not. Okay, our next question can be for both scientists, but we'll start with Helen. And the question is, what types of animals are there in our waterways? And Eliana, who's 8, asked that.
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, we have your fish, we have crabs, oysters. Sometimes we see seals and even whales go up the Hudson River. I think last year there was a big event about how they saw a whale. Oh, and awesome. And so this is a really cool figure and graphic. You can actually download it off the New York Aquarium website, just about the diversity of the different kinds of animals that you can see in New York City. And we often don't think about that, right? That there's just so much wildlife in our New York waterways. My personal favorite, and I'll show you my little cool toy. I hope you guys know what this is. Maybe you've seen it on our beaches. It is a horseshoe crab, and despite its name, it's actually not a crab. They're more related to, their cousins rather, are related to spiders and scorpions. So this is, if you ever see an animal like this, be careful, be gentle, try not to pull from its tail because its tail is really fragile. This is just a toy. But it's, and don't be afraid of it. This is what it looks like underneath, right? And it looks a little alien-like, but they're probably one of the more gentle, nicest animals, you know, marine animals in our waterways, and we can see them on our shorelines, which is pretty cool.
That's super cool. Yeah, I've seen some of those shells on specifically in Jamaica Bay too. Rab, did you want to add anything else? We also have a more specific question that's about what kind of fish live in the Hudson River from Mia, who's 8. So maybe you can have something on for this.
Sure, I can start on that. I want to show a picture of when we pull our cages out of the water, we often find lots of little fish in them. And so this is one that people don't really realize may be living here, but this is native to New York. It's a seahorse. So the kind of fish, and people think, oh, well, those come from other places, but actually there's a native seahorse that lives in New York Harbor. So that's something we see. But I'm most interested in shellfish because that's my job. And I want to just point out one other animal that we think about a lot. It's a predator of an oyster, and it's called an oyster drill. And you can see a picture of it here. They're actually really small. They're only about this long, but they have a very sharp kind of a proboscis or a tongue, and they can drill holes in the shell of the oyster and slurp the oyster right out of the shell, which obviously isn't good for us. So we keep our eyes on these things, and we do see a lot of them, and we worry that maybe there might be too many of them. That hasn't happened yet, though.
That's interesting, thinking about like the food chain, right, in our rivers. We might not be eating the oysters that are growing in New York waterways, but we know that there's a critter out there who really likes them. Okay, I have a question from Karen, who is 8, and this is for Helen, and she wants to know, are there any sea creatures that we actually don't know about?
I mean, it's a possibility, right? So sometimes what we think as sea creatures that are more from tropical regions can end up in our waterways just because of how the ocean currents bring up some of those creatures. But it takes people discovering things. So you mentioned if it's safe to swim in the Hudson River. There are people that actually scuba dive in the Hudson River and also in the East River. And they sometimes see cool animals that we may not be aware of, right? Sometimes we'll see animals that are not native to our area. They're called invasive species. And those animals, they are foreign to us, and so they're foreign to the system, and so they don't really have a natural enemy or a predator to eat them. And so that's something important that we would want to know, right? So we can better manage those species. So yeah, absolutely.
Cool. We have a scientist who actually used to work with us, James Townsend, who just published on a cool comb jellyfish. So I think there are a couple of things we actually, probably a lot of things we don't know about our oceans. But thankfully we have some scientists really studying the New York waterways. So for those, we have a little bit more clearance. Okay, I have one question that I know is going to be a really hard one. Maybe we'll start with Helen and then we'll go to Rob. But Victoria, who's 10, wants to know what made so many fish die in the Hudson River.
Yeah, so you've probably seen on the news about a lot of fish coming up onto shore dead. It's actually, as of recently, happened a lot over the years, and a lot of scientists are trying to figure that out. But a lot of people think that, or a lot of scientists think that it's due to the lack of air or oxygen in the water. Like, all animals need air to breathe. Fish breathe through their gills, and there's oxygen in the water for them to breathe that air or that oxygen. If there's not enough oxygen in the water, that makes fish pretty vulnerable and weak. And so they end up dying off. And we're seeing that happen during the summer months where it gets really hot and there's lack of oxygen. And so a lot of scientists think it's because the water has very little to no oxygen in the Hudson, which is causing so many fish to die off.
Cool. It's a little bit sad to think about. Rob, did you have something to add?
I am really surprised by that story, and I think it deserves more study. We have seen big die-offs from low oxygen, but this was along such a long stretch of the Hudson, and it's a big river, and it shouldn't be low in oxygen for that long of a stretch, even though it's been so hot. So I was very surprised, and I think more experiments need to be done before we really know what happened there. And I hope that the government agencies that are responsible for that are pursuing it, because I'm very curious.
Yeah, so we can continue studying whether our waterways around New York City are healthy and what might have changed to make that like low oxygen level so much larger, I guess, cover so much more space. So if you are just joining our town hall, my name is Marina, and I'm here with two scientists, Helen and Rob, that study the health and science of rivers and waters around New York City. We want to hear your questions. What do you want to know? Put them in the chat and we'll ask them to our scientists. So let's take some questions from the chat. Brianna?
A question for Helen is, are they actually crabs, and they are used for medicine, right?
So horseshoe crabs, which I'll bring up my little toy here, they're actually not crabs. They look like them, right? But their closest cousins are actually spiders and scorpions. So they really don't fall under the same family, so to speak. They are very important. That's a really good, you guys are really smart out there. Their blood is actually really important to the biomedical industry. They check, the blood is used to check for any contamination in the medicine that we eat, in the, when you go visit the doctor and they pull blood out of the needle and stuff, they make sure that's clean. And they use horseshoe crab blood in order to make sure that they are free out of contamination and bacteria. So they're really important, which is why we need to do so much to protect these animals.
Awesome. Yeah, I know that especially when an animal is useful for our purposes, sometimes we have to be extra careful about protecting their population. Brianna, do we have another question?
Another question is from Harvey, age 9. He would like to know if a sperm whale can go into New York Harbor?
And that's for anybody.
Well, there's nobody taking toll under the Verrazano Bridge. So in theory, if a whale wanted to go into the harbor, it could. And as Helen said, smaller whales have swum into the harbor. I've never heard of a sperm whale, which is a really big ocean-going whale, and a toothed whale, which means it eats big things. I've never heard of one coming into New York Harbor. I know that off the mouth of the harbor, there are a lot of right whales, which are also big ocean-going whales, and they are cruising, they are migrating north and south, and that the law has been changed so that ships that are entering the harbor during certain seasons have to slow down in order to diminish the chance of a whale getting hit by a ship. So the whales are out there and they're not far away, and humpback whales come in really close and probably do go into the harbor. And Helen probably knows more about that than me, but the big sperm whale, that really would be quite a story if one came into the harbor.
Yeah, I'll also add that sperm whales are, I haven't heard of that, though we may not know because we don't see them. But sometimes we have seen, or people have seen, humpback whales go into New York Harbor and up the Hudson River. And that's because they're trying to follow the bait fish. That's what they eat. And sometimes they do go up into the harbor, into the river.
Well, that would probably be a really interesting indicator of our waterway health. All right, I think we have one more from the chat before we move on.
Another question is, are there migrating animals that travel seasonally?
That's for anyone. And also we don't have the name for that one, but the handle is LPAQUEO, El Paqueo. If anybody wants to talk about those migrating animals, go for it.
I'll talk about my favorite animal, the horseshoe crab. So horseshoe crabs, they migrate, meaning that during the spring and summer seasons, they'll come closer to shore and in shallow waters to mate and lay eggs and make new babies and horseshoe crabs. And then during the late summer into fall and winter, they go back into deeper waters. So that's an example of migration on a smaller scale. But there's certainly fish that can make migration seasonally.
Yeah, I'd just like to mention one of those fish, which is an eel. And they have a very unusual migration pattern, which is backwards from most other fish, and in that they apparently, nobody really knows the details yet on this, but they meet out at sea in order to reproduce. And then the tiny baby eels migrate up the river and spend their entire lives up in various parts of the estuary and even higher up. And then when they've reached maturity and they're ready to mate, they travel back out to sea to this mysterious place that nobody really understands yet. And so it's great that there still are big mysteries like that left that people don't fully understand. And it means there's room for study and room for marine biologists to keep going. There's just so much that isn't known yet.
Room for some of our viewers right now, maybe to answer that question for us. So we're going to move into our tools section of the discussion. So this one's for Rob and Helen. Maybe Helen can go first. And the question is from Joanna, who is 8, and she wants to know if there is a special tool that you use a lot.
Oh, wow. Maybe I'm not one of the most exciting people. I use the computer a lot. I use the phone a lot, actually, more than the computer. I talk to a lot of people, a lot of different people, from researchers and community members, teachers, students, etc. So I use a phone way more often than I use the computer, and maybe that's my special tool. The other thing I guess I use a lot are maps. Maps to show where different people live, maps to show the waterways, and maps to show different parts of the city, like where are our parks, where are our beaches. So I would say the telephone and maps are really valuable to me.
Cool.
Well, let me show you one tool that we use a lot. You know, we're putting oysters into the harbor, and when we put them in cages like this, and when we put them in at first, they're really little, and then they grow. And we want to be able to track how much they're growing, and are there places in the harbor where oysters grow faster and do better than other places. And so that means that you measure the oysters when you put them in, and then you have to go back and measure them a month or 2 months or whatever your period of time is later, and then collect all that data and compare it. And then you can say for sure, this part of the harbor or that part of the harbor is the best for growing oysters. So this is the tool. This is a really basic tool called calipers. And on it, I don't know if you can see, but there's a scale of millimeters across the bottom and inches across the top. And you take a shell and you simply put the shell in, and we always measure oysters in the longest possible direction. So from the bill of the oyster back to the joint of it, and then okay, so this is a 100, I don't know if you can see, 120 millimeter oyster. And this is really, it's a simple tool, but we use it all the time, and it really is valuable because we get absolutely useful data out of it. Oysters grow the best in this place or that place.
Cool, Rob, thank you. We have a question that I think is specifically good for you. And the question is from Joel, who's 8. And Joel wants to know, are there any scientific tools that you've made?
Scientific tools that we made, I don't know. Finola, what do you think? Have we made, I mean, I'm not sure that a boat counts as a scientific tool, but we have made a lot of boats and we use them. We use them to haul gear around. We use them to explore shallow parts of the harbor. We use small wooden boats. And, you know, we also make, like, this is a really fun thing to do, but we make all of these cages, most of them on Governor's Island, often with volunteers, and a lot of times with student volunteers. So we're snipping, you know, we're using this kind of tool. I mean, it's a very basic pair of pliers with some snips in it. And we're also doing a lot with this, and this is also a tool, rope, line, we call it. So we are making a lot of things that we use in order to grow oysters. And it's a really fun part of the job.
Cool. I think boats definitely count, especially if they're specifically used for shallow waters.
I wish I had one here, but they're just kind of too big to bring into the lab. So
yeah, I can imagine they're probably pretty large. Okay, so this next question is for Helen. Lindsay, who's 12, was wondering about how you can know what a person's DNA is after testing them. So we're wondering if you can use DNA as a tool to study what's happening in the water.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is really new science and new research methods. There's a method or a type of process or a way to do science called environmental DNA or eDNA. And it's basically collecting samples from the water or soil or even air of things that have been there before, right? So we as humans, we shed skin, we shed hair, right? But we can take the things like hair or you know, even sweat, be able to detect what was left behind. So you can sort of think about that with animals, right? Animals shed hair, they shed scales, they pee in the water, right? And you can take a sample of water, for example, use the methods of eDNA or environmental DNA to know who was there before, right? So it's really cool science, and we're just learning about how we can use it to be able to detect whether there was a cool species that was here once before, or whether there was an invasive species. So it's really neat.
Cool, Helen. That's interesting. So using some more like molecular biology to understand something really, really large, right? Something really big. So we have a question from the chat. Again, Harvey, age 9. Brianna, do you want to tell us that question?
How often do you use sonar?
That's kind of a big question. I wonder if anybody here does use sonar. Is that necessary for your research?
We don't use sonar in our work. We are out in boats a lot, and we use something that's similar. We call it a depth finder, and it's a similar device that pings a sound signal off the bottom, and that tells us if we're getting into water that's too shallow for the boat to be in. The problem with that machine is that it doesn't always work. And you can get into shallow places and not realize how shallow they are. And it's very easy sometimes to break the propeller on the boat or to run the boat into a rock. And, but you just have to go slow and be careful. And usually works out.
Yeah, cool. Harvey mentioned that he would use sonar to see where things are underwater, see how deep some parts are. Oh, Harvey's a she. Okay, Harvey would like to know, would use sonar to do that, to know how deep some parts are and to track whales. So Harvey's really into the sperm whales, I think. That's a cool area of study. Okay, we have one more question from the chat if Brianna wants to tell us.
What is causing the low oxygen?
That is a great question. I can take that. What creates oxygen for us in air? Plants, right? We need trees. They take in the carbon dioxide. They need the sunlight. Through a process of photosynthesis, they sort of spit out air, I guess. It's sort of the same thing in water, except with more like aquatic plants. However, there are other things in the water, like pollution can be a cause for low oxygen, but also a lot of algae, and a lot of growth that's happening, which kind of can create low oxygen conditions. And that's driven by a lot of things, phosphorus and nitrogen. And so these things can take up a lot of oxygen, and then doesn't leave enough oxygen for everything else, like the animals that live in the water. And so when you have a lot of growth, like an algae growth or plankton growth, and they're taking up a lot of that oxygen, it doesn't leave enough oxygen for the other animals in the water. I don't know, Rob, maybe you can answer that question as well.
No, I think that's absolutely right. It's I mean, I would call it nutrients, but like you're saying, it's nitrogen, it's phosphorus. There's an overload of that, and that's because we're this giant city right on the water, and so we can't help but dump nutrients into the harbor, and so that just creates, it's too rich of a diet, too much growth, and then the oxygen levels soar and then crash, and it's that up and down cycle in the oxygen that really is hard on marine animals. And that is where those extreme low numbers come from. And it can mean sometimes, the oxygen level is good for most of the day, but then it will crash late at night, early in the morning. And that's when, people say, well, it's only an hour a day, it's fine. But if somebody came to your house and turned the oxygen off for an hour, that would be enough to do you in, right? So that it's the same problem that we have here.
Thanks, Rob. Okay, we're going to move into the last portion of our session today, and our question is from Esleika, and she's 12. Sorry if I mispronounced that. And they want to know, what are the examples of changes in marine and ocean ecosystems caused by the ongoing global warming process?
I'll take that. There are a lot of changes happening. I'll mention briefly to set Rob up ocean acidification, but also the warming of our waters. A lot of our animals are not used to really hot waters, which is currently happening. And so, you know, we're starting to see a change in how our marine habitats and our ecosystems are doing. We're also, you know, on the more climate side of things, we're also seeing more flooding happening due to rising sea levels. And that's due to many things. It's due to the warming of our waters again, but also due to the melting sea ice that's happening in the Arctic and the Antarctic. So there's a lot of things that are happening in our marine ecosystems that not only affect our animals, but also us too.
Thanks, Helen. So I guess on that note, Marley, who's 14, wants to know what can children and junior scientists do to protect and research marine life and biology? Rob, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. I'm sure Helen has some stuff to say too. I think that what we used to call citizen science, we now call community science, is really a great field for young people. And there's a lot of opportunity basically to volunteer with groups like ours or with other groups and to help out. And I'll give you 2 examples. Helping Billion Oyster Project build oyster cages so that we can deploy oysters in more and more parts of the harbor is a really fun thing to do as a school group or with your parents or a community group. And then also with our water testing program, helping to take samples and take them to the lab and helping to process those samples. You're really a part of the process, and all of the data that you're collecting, even with calipers and collecting data on oysters growing, all of that data, if it's properly managed, can really be useful in finding long-term solutions. So volunteering as a community scientist would be my first recommendation.
I'll also second that volunteering and community science. We also lead a community science and taking pictures of flooded streets in your neighborhood. And that helps us understand what the future of rising sea levels will look like and where these areas are. We don't have a firm grasp of flooded streets in our neighborhood on a sunny blue sky day. So we are working with a lot of community members and actually a lot of our youth to take pictures of flooded streets and to send it to us too. So that's another great example, another plus for community science as well.
Thanks, Helen and Rob, for answering both of those. I think the overwhelming response is to help organizations and just basically continue doing what you're doing right now, right? You're here to learn about waterways, and that's a really important thing to do. So that is all the time that we have for today. Thank you everyone who joined us for yet another student town hall, and thanks for everyone who submitted questions. And then a special thanks to our guests, Helen and Rob and Brianna, for answering our questions, asking and answering our questions. Last thing I want to share with you is, here we go. So the next town hall, like I said, is all about birds. It is at 1 p.m. So that is our new summertime. All summer, we will be having our town halls at 1 p.m. on Thursdays. And that's all for today. So remember to check out our website if you want any more resources, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Thank you for joining.